Yo, we should do one cold open for this entire thing and only do it once
Yeah.
and never do it again.
Yeah. Just
I
throw
actually
people
am
off.
not I'm not against cold opens. But I prefer the like once every 2 months cold open than the you are expected to have a cold open.
Yeah.
Like Up First actually does a cold open
Yeah.
once every like 3 months, and it's always like incredibly adorable. Like they save it
That's
for
good.
like actually good crosstalk banter, and not like we have to have a cold open. It's easy to take a wide view of history and say that human beings are driven by forces outside of their control. That through vying for resources and advantage, humans just kind of wound up where they are in the world. History is so big, so vast, that it's impossible to throw it to something else. And while that's a wiser view than the typical great man style of history, it's important to note the rare occasions where human choices matter. So today we will discuss perhaps the greatest turning point in American history, where the nation faced a crossroads and chose to walk down the most despicable path: Reconstruction. Welcome, one and all, to the No One Is Competent podcast, the premier program trying to show you that everyone who's ever been in power has done a terrible job at it. My name is Azalea, and I am joined, as always, by Jay. Jay, how we feeling today?
Huh? All right. Well enough. I apologize if I sound a little bit like I'm half dead. I'm still just getting over a migraine. I assure you that I'm only 40% dead.
Yeah,
somewhere like that.
Jay's default is 20. Like, Jay's vitality bar is incredibly low. He's got like 7 hit points.
Yeah.
Like, he's always about 20% dead, just as a baseline.
I mean, like, for context, if I go see a movie in a movie theater, like an action film, that drops my HP by like a third.
Yeah, even if it's a good movie, like we saw independently the Batman, we were discussing it. Jay's like, yeah, I really loved it. Had a splitting headache afterwards, but
Yeah, good movie. Do recommend, but if you're like me, you will get a headache.
I mean, the score in that movie is like completely unrelenting, and if you have like good surround sound, it is just like deluging your ears with pounding bass constantly, which might not be the most pleasant thing in the world. I was thinking, Jay, maybe my intro's gotten a bit stale. My like, hello one and all, welcome to the podcast, and I'm joined by Jay. Like, I feel like I got good at it. We obviously, like, we kind of fumbled through the first few, and like, now I'm just kind of going rote. Wonder if I need to change up my game.
You just got to start doing impersonations during the introduction, just pretending to be people.
Or you could introduce the podcast.
Maybe someday.
So once again, thank you for listening. Please follow us on Twitter at @not_competent. Is that it?
That's correct. Yes.
At @not_competent. You can email us podcast suggestions at, or just, you know, if you want to talk, at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. Our music is by the legendary Sam Bryce. And now let's tell a show about how America chose to be incredibly lame, shall we?
Yes.
So, Jay, we're doing this episode a little different than we normally do our program.
Yeah.
We've kind of started joking at this point about how much context we like to lay out for events. And we are discussing today the Reconstruction era of the United States, 1865 to 1877, right after the American Civil War. And, you know, we could spend an hour, hell, 10 hours on a discussion of the colonization of North America, the importing of African slaves to fuel agrarian industrial economies, America's founding, its first 80 years of political history, and how a cultural divide over slavery led to the inevitable Civil War. But, like, we're actually not going to do that.
Now, you see, first we have to talk about the Portuguese exploration of Africa in the 1500s. Then we can go on to that, or we can just skip it entirely.
One of the best classes that I ever took in my brief delusional stint in college was a history of colonial Latin America, and the professor on a like colonial Latin America class, he did start with, now for the first 100,000 years of American history, the Homo sapien population resided mostly in what is now Sudan, but it was suppressed by the tsetse fly. This is how he talked. But as soon as humans were able to escape the wrath of that particular insect, they spread across the world. And it's like, none of this is going to be on the test. It's just like, well, if you're going to start history, that's where he chose to start.
I mean, you know what they say. To bake a cake from scratch, first you must invent the universe.
So instead, we are going to describe what America, and more specifically, what the Southern American states looked like in May of 1865. This episode is about what Reconstruction was, what fueled it, the ideological components going into it, and how America exited it. And so, let's just like get a lay of the land of if you like just beamed down to Earth in 1865 and you landed in, say, Mississippi or Tennessee or some shit. What would you see? What civilization was occurring at that time?
Well, what you'd see, or where you'd wind up, I suppose, would be in essentially a defeated country, an occupied territory at this point, because on April 9th of 1865, General Lee signed the documents that surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant's Union forces at the courthouse of Appomattox, Virginia. Now, this action, which is very famous, would signal the end of the Civil War, as Confederate forces across the country followed suit in the coming weeks. 1 month later, on May 9th, the president declared an official end to the Civil War. The Confederate States of America was no more. The Union had won. That president, however, was not Abraham Lincoln, the man who had led the country during the course of the war. Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14th by a Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, was sworn in as president the following day.
Throughout the war, Abraham Lincoln had proved highly skilled at holding together the nascent Republican Party. This party represented a wide range of interests and constituencies, and you have to remember, it wasn't even like 20 years old at the time. But it was united in its opposition of the Southern secessionists. As we like to say on this podcast, Lincoln was a member of the coveted most esoteric club in history, which is to say that he is one of the 2 American politicians that you can say were at least somewhat competent at doing what they did.
Yeah.
But he was far from perfect. He made his fair share of mistakes, and unfortunately for the country, one of Lincoln's biggest mistakes was the selection of his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a man devoid of just about any redeeming quality, and who would become the worst president in the history of the United States. Man, you remember during the Trump era where like all of the liberals would say this is the worst president we've ever had,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, he is going to be like at a maximum the 5th,
Yeah.
and even then, I don't even think he got that far. Like, I think Johnson and Buchanan are like the clean 1 and 2, and I really don't see anyone cracking that.
I would agree. Yeah, it's really hard to top them.
Think about it. You have a man ruling the Union that just defeated the South. And who is that man? He's a Southerner. Johnson was from the Scots-Irish community in North Carolina. Members of this community, who were mostly small farmers, resented the wealthy slave-owning elites of the South, but that doesn't mean they were abolitionists. Johnson himself had moved to Tennessee and essentially become a slave owner himself, owning 10 slaves until 1863. He was elected to the Senate representing the Democratic Party in 1857.
Yeah, when Tennessee was recaptured by the Union Army in 1862, Johnson, who had, like many of those upcountry Southerners, remained loyal to the Union, was appointed the military governor of the state by Lincoln. In 1864, Lincoln selected Johnson as his vice presidential candidate going into the presidential election, likely out of a desire to show unity by picking a pro-Union Southern Democrat as his running mate.
Yeah, that election was a lot closer than it had any reason logically to be, and like Lincoln wanted to show unity. And it's also, this is something that's like not taught a lot in American history, but like to my knowledge, like Appalachian Southerners were far less likely to be loyal to the Confederacy.
Yes.
So
I mean,
like,
that's why.
For example, tell him, Jay.
I was going to say that's why the state of West Virginia exists.
Yeah, just straight up, there was a Virginia, and then Virginia seceded from the Union, and then the mountain folk of Virginia was like, well, we are seceding from you, and we are going back. One of the 2 cool things that West Virginia ever did, of course, the other one being the Battle of Blair Mountain. But, so yeah, people in Tennessee doing the same would also, kind of track with that trend. Of course, there were towns in the north, small pockets of the north, that either wanted to succeed, kind of practically succeed, or basically like there are, for example, parts of Pennsylvania that just did not resist Lee's advance. The country was obviously a lot more complicated than just a black and white. And also, those members of the South that stayed with the Union, this does not necessarily mean they were anti-slavery, as, of course, as we will get into, the Union had slave states in it while they were fighting the war.
Yeah. Now, Johnson, in other words, was not someone who had come through the ranks of the Republican Party. He hated, and was hated by most of the party leadership, and following the conclusion of the war, his closest political allies would be other Southern Democrats, most of whom had supported the Confederates. Now, for being a generally unlikable racist drunkard, as well as for other reasons we'll get into later, Johnson would become the first U.S. president to be impeached by the House of Representatives, though he was later acquitted by the Senate by a margin of just 1 vote.
That fucker who cast that 1 vote.
Yeah.
We could do an entire podcast on Johnson's presidency. We do have to emphasize that he was drunk. It's weird that Grant gets sort of the moniker of like the alcoholic president of the United States, where like Johnson was like visibly drunk at his inauguration, and like everyone else in DC is just like, who the hell is this guy? He was just the least fit man for the job. So that's the guy overseeing all of this. Moving on down to the ground, we find a country in complete ruin. Both the Union and Confederacy suffered over 800 casualties apiece, with Union dead totaling around 365,000, and Confederate fatalities totaling around 290,000. For context, the entire U.S. Army lost around 290,000 men during all of World War II, when we were, of course, a much larger country. Confederate infrastructure had been heavily damaged by the war. Part of the Union's strategy during the war was to make it so it was kind of impossible for the Confederate economy to really exist. This involved tearing up train tracks, blockading the rivers, obviously, famously blockading the entire coast of the country. You had stocks of horses, mules, and cattle, this is the beast of burden vital to the economy, had dropped by almost a half. Income was down by a similar factor. You had years of hyperinflation. And Union infrastructure remained in better condition, with industrial output having been increased to fuel the war effort. But territories closer to the front lines had not gone untouched. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, but I assume that the Union economy kind of went through a weird contraction once all of the war production stopped, maybe similar as what happened during World War I.
Yeah, there was a contraction, with the conclusion of the war and the scaling back of the army. And then you'd later have a boom period a little bit later on in the 1860s, which we'll kind of go into later. But yes, there was a contraction.
So the South has fought, they have been invaded, they have been devastated, and now they are being occupied.
Yeah, and when the southern states had seceded from the Union in 1861, they had basically taken their senators and representatives with them, vacating their seats in Congress. Now, these seats were subsequently declared vacant by Congress. As a result, at the conclusion of the war in 1865, the southern states, now under Union control, were without any representation. This would not change immediately, as the former Confederate States was viewed as occupied enemy territory by the Republicans, who had near complete control of the remaining 21 states in Congress. But yeah, that's important to remember. The CSA, or the former CSA at this point in time, they're not states, legally speaking. They have to be readmitted to the Union one by one.
Yeah, they're actually military occupied territories, and I think Georgia and Florida were a unit, for example. They're all under different military governors. Now, there were some fringe groups, mostly those old Southerners who would stick with the Union, who want to just readmit everyone and water under the bridge, bygones be bygones. But at this point, the Republicans are still have a degree of sanity, and they're no, these people are traitors who just resulted in a war that had 500,000 of us getting killed. We are not going to let them off the hook.
Yeah.
But also, this means that for this period, the United States should be a one-party state, or kind of could have been a one-party state. How true that was, we'll get into it a bit. But suffice to say, the Republicans have the ability to, hypothetically, do whatever they wanted and rule over a South that has a broken economy, many dead people, and a very resentful and poor white population. But then that leads us to the most interesting and important factor of the United States and the Southern United States during this time of Reconstruction. Perhaps even you might call the main characters of our story, which are the 3.7 million black slaves that have just been freed. Think about this. I want to, this is not in our notes, but I just kind of want to back up. We haven't mentioned this far, but to be incredibly clear, the U.S. Civil War was fought over slavery. Slavery was the point. There are multiple states that when they seceded and joined the Confederacy, they publicly wrote that they were doing this over the issue of slavery. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, gave an entire speech about how slavery, like, is the cultural divider between North and South and the reason that there should be two countries. Everyone at the time understood that the war was about slavery. Like, Lincoln, the South seceded when it did because they feared that Lincoln's ascension as president would lead to the abolition of slavery. Now, it's incredibly true that the war was not prosecuted by the Union under the cause of slavery at first. It was prosecuted in order to, keep the American empire together. But that shifted in January 1st of 1863 when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a point where the war was kind of up in the air on who was going to win, and Lincoln wanted a sort of more moral and, one might say, philosophical push to solidify the Union cause. This executive order declared all slaves in the rebel states free. Now, a lot of people will maybe learn in school in 4th grade that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. I mean, that's what literally the words Emancipation Proclamation mean. But it freed the slaves in all of the rebel states, meaning that Lincoln was declaring free the slaves in the states that he did not have control over at the time. It did not abolish slavery in the Union slaveholding states. Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. What it basically meant is wherever the Union Army had conquered into the Confederacy at the time, those slaves were to be freed. And the entire South at that point, like the southern United States, were an institution completely devoted to the institution of black slavery. That the entire civilization revolved around it in a way that is even now kind of hard to comprehend. Like, their infrastructure, their economy, their religion, their intellectualism was all built around propagating slavery, making it difficult for slaves to break out of bondage, justifying slavery, both in religious and academic contexts, and exporting and dealing with the stuff that slaves produce on the grand plantations. And to illustrate just how much of an insane shift this is, if you are in Virginia in 1865, when the war is over and the slaves are now freed, the institution of slavery in Virginia in 1865 is older then than the Civil War is now. It is an ancient institution that everything has been built around, and it is now over. And all of the slaves are free. And now America is going to have to deal with that. How do we integrate both a previously treasonous population and a previously slave population into our economy, into our society? What are they going to do? What is everyone's relationship going to be? And this process of incorporation would form a broader part of the policies that were given the name Reconstruction. Broadly speaking, Reconstruction was the effort undertaken to reintegrate the former Confederate states in the United States and remake their society and economy in an image of the North.
The party in charge of the country during this time period was, of course, the Republican Party. Now, for a little bit of historical context, because, I'm sure most of our listeners are probably familiar with the Republican Party as it is today, but might not be aware of where it began, especially if you're not from the United States. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 and would then quickly subsume the dying Whig Party and the Free Soil movement to become the largest opposition party in the United States. Now, one of the core tenets of the Republican Party was its opposition to the expansion of slavery. Many white Northerners were very committed in their belief that hard work and economic opportunity were key elements of what it meant to be an American. You can see this as a descendant of the idea of the Protestant work ethic. They disdained the Southern slaveholders not out of a love for slaves, but out of a disgust for what they viewed as an old-fashioned system that had limited social mobility and which closely resembled the landed gentry of Europe. These Northerners feared that the great western expanses of the growing United States would be chopped up into plantations and owned by these aristocratic slave owners, staffed by millions of slaves. This would thereby deprive the common white man of the opportunity to seek their own fortunes in the West. It would also tip the balance in Congress in favor of the South. This fear was heightened by the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. That's what led to the founding of the party, because that act had repealed the earlier Missouri Compromise that had basically set a geographic limit on which new states would be slave-owning and which ones would be free.
The Republican Party, however, was not unified on their position on slavery in its entirety. There was amongst them factions, the most notable being the so-called radical Republicans, who took the completely radical and insane stance that is the abolitionist position. The stance that slavery is bad and amoral and a-Christian and it should be ended. That crazy radical stance. They're still called the radical Republicans to this day, by the way, historically, which is great. They advocated for the end of slavery as an institution throughout the United States. There were, of course, the more moderate, so-called liberal Republicans, on the other hand, who simply sought to block the westward expansion of slavery. This, of course, resulted in movements like Bleeding Kansas and a lot of controversies over what states would become slave and what states would become free as they were added to the Union because, again, both during and before the Civil War, slavery was the biggest issue in the country and had completely dictated the country's politics for decades previous to that. So, unlike most Northerners in general, many of these abolitionists were motivated by a genuine concern for the well-being of black slaves, though most of them still held paternalistic attitudes towards them. It's important when talking about this period to, realize that racism and racial views are, sort of a relative concept. If you scan the brain of almost anyone maybe not William Lloyd Garrison, but more or less anyone in this period, you would probably find that they held beliefs about groups of people that we would now call racist. But considering that this is also a time in America where, slavery is an institution and part of America, the curve is different. The way people understand things is different. And it is also important to remember, when you're talking about the North as an institution, the North as a civilization, this is a massive, huge place, right? And it is not, even though the Republicans are all on the side of at least curtailing the expansion of slavery, if not ending it. Obviously, they would all kind of come together under the Emancipation Proclamation, which would sort of end that debate. But it was not like every Northerner was a committed abolitionist or even really cared about slavery. And they might find it personally dumb. But the idea that, for instance, everyone joined the Union Army so they could fight and destroy slavery and free the slaves is not true. One of the largest, if not the largest, I have to look it up, riots in American history happened in Philadelphia of people trying to dodge the draft.
Yeah.
So, during Reconstruction, this earlier split between those who wanted to end slavery and those who wanted to simply curtail it remained. You still have the radicals and the liberals. And the radicals supported more forceful policies during the Reconstruction, while as the liberals called for reconciliation with the South. They were people who would be more, all water under the bridge, let's just let bygones be bygones, let's welcome them back in. And having absorbed previously most of the Whigs, the Free Soilers, and various other movements, the Republican Party as a whole would come to represent many different interests and communities, from bankers and industrialists to small farmers and military veterans. This is a single one-party rule, but that one party is far from unified.
Yeah. Opposing them as the main opposition was the Democratic Party, which prior to the Civil War had been the dominant party in U.S. politics since the days of Andrew Jackson. The Democrats, now were obviously in a much weakened position due to the fact that most of the South did not have any representation in Congress, but they were still around and they were, plotting their comeback.
Yeah, and there were Democrats in the North.
Oh yeah, like the Republicans, the Democrats represented a broad coalition. And, this is kind of the ways in which politics in the 1860s are different from, or maybe would seem a little bit weird to people today, where we think of the Southern Democrats as the heart of the Democrat Party in this time period, but one of their hugest centers of support is in New York, around New York City, and you have, Tammany Hall and the Democratic political machine. And a lot of their presidential candidates, we'll see later, Tilden, are New Yorkers. So you have this coalition of both Southern, many of them slave owners, but Southern whites, as well as these urban Northerners. Whereas the Republicans are a bit stronger. We might think in the suburban or rural communities in a lot of the North.
Yeah, Lincoln himself came from, Illinois timberlands.
Yeah.
So, those are the people who are handing down the laws and, determining what is going to be done with these Confederate states that are currently under military occupation. What's going to be done with all of these suddenly freed slaves who now have to, conduct their lives completely differently. So, let's start on a high note and mention the good ideas, of which there were several, starting with the Reconstruction Acts, which were a series of acts passed from 1867 to 68 that split the former Confederacy into 5 military districts for the sake of administration. These required every state to ratify the 13th and the 14th Amendments, which we will get to, before being allowed formal readmission into the United States. And it barred the former Confederate states from disenfranchising men based on race and skin color. Obviously, they say men because women have not been granted the right to vote at this point. Now, these seem like incredibly baseline, totally chill, even just bare bones requirements, right? Hey, you have to agree the slaves are free and that they're U.S. citizens, and you're not allowed to let them not vote. Andrew Johnson, however, argued that this was discrimination against white people and vetoed these acts, only to have his vetoes overturned by Congress. The radical Republicans, remember, who are the good guys, saw the acts as key to break the power of former slave owners, something they viewed as necessary for the transformation of Southern society. Radical Republicans wanted the South after the Civil War to look very different than the South before the Civil War.
Yeah. A big part of why Johnson is impeached, they'll come up with legal justifications, which are I think kind of true, but the real reason why he's impeached is basically Congress just got tired of him vetoing everything. And I don't think there's another U.S. president in history who so routinely vetoes measures that his own party or own quote-unquote party passes in Congress and then has those vetoes overturned again and again. So yeah, they were
Yeah,
just tired of the guy.
yeah, and Johnson, I do think, like, officially, like, the impeachment vote was, like, something to do with Johnson, like, trying to fire his Secretary of War that Congress liked, and they were mad about that. Obviously, impeachments then, and as impeachments now, are, like, basically purely politically motivated, which is fine, by the way, personally.
Yeah, I mean, probably would have been better if he actually was removed by the Senate.
Yeah, like, and once again, Johnson was one of those guys who believe that any degree of granting rights to, giving anything to the black population, or even just acknowledging their humanity, essentially was discrimination against white people. He was one of those guys, in case you're wondering how old that trend is.
Yeah. Now, to go on to those amendments which we mentioned, the 13th Amendment, which was eventually ratified in 1865, would abolish slavery and involuntary servitude. Now, this formally ended slavery in its last holdouts, which were Kentucky and Delaware, meaning that the actual last holdouts of slavery were in the Union, not the Confederacy. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, is actually like a really big amendment. It has a lot of different clauses.
It is arguably the most important part of the entire U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. But basically, some of the things it does is it gives citizenship to all individuals born or naturalized in the U.S. That obviously applies to slaves, or former slaves, I should say.
Yeah. If you were born on the dirt that is called U.S. dirt, you are an American citizen. That was not a thing. I know I'm interrupting too much, but, like, this is one of the wildest things
important
to me about U.S. history, is that, like, before the 14th Amendment, there's actually, like, a massive argument in America about, like, who is an American citizen, and a lot of it is tied to whiteness, and, like, a lot of it involves people trying to, quote-unquote, prove that they're white. So you have, for example, like, a Syrian man arguing that he's white, and, like, what a court in one state saying that he is white, and a court in another state saying that he's not white, and just like, just the most dumbass shit. Just, like, complete clown show shit.
Yeah.
Over citizenship in America. Which is why the 14th Amendment is as important as it is, because it did, hopefully and mostly, end all of that clown show shit. Not actually, though, because then California would try and deny that right to Asian people for, like, 50 years after this, but, you know, it's a good document. Which, as an anarchist, I do not say often about part of a state's constitution.
Yeah. Yeah, the 14th Amendment would also guarantee equal protection to these citizens. It dealt with the apportionment of representatives because, you know, if you went to school in the U.S., you might remember before the Civil War, slaves for the purpose of the census were counted as 3/5 of, you know, a white person when determining the population of the South and thereby the amount of representatives the South would have in Congress. The northern states were now kind of worried that with all the slaves being free, them being citizens, the South would have a lot more seats now. And basically the 14th Amendment says that, yes, they do get these extra seats, but only if they don't disenfranchise black voters. Obviously, we'll see that's not really enforced down the road.
Yeah, but this is another thing, is that, like, this means hypothetically that if, like, the southern states are readmitted, they would have a massive amount of more political power because they now have way more U.S. citizens in them who can vote.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, everyone's thinking about. Everyone's wondering, like, if, you know, you give these black Americans voting power, they're then going to do something about it. And no one fully knows what's going to happen. We'll get into what happens in a bit. But that's a sort of chaos factor on everyone's minds.
Yeah. And it did some other things like disqualification from office if you're involved in insurrection, and dealing with the validity of public debt. Basically saying that, all the debts that the Confederate States had owed to foreign governments, the U.S. was not going to pay, because that was debt made in support of insurrection.
Good. Fuck them.
Yeah. And then we'd also get the 15th Amendment in 1870, which would prohibit the federal government and states from denying people the right to vote based on race, color, or position of previous servitude. Now, this is important because you might remember those Reconstruction acts said that the Confederate States could not disenfranchise men based on race and skin color. They did not say anything about northern states which had remained in the Union.
No, they did not.
So there were still northern states which were not allowing black people to vote. And, there have been multiple referendums in northern states to allow black people to vote, which had failed. The 15th Amendment would finally expand that, expand the vote for black people across the country.
Black men.
Yes. A very important point. Yes, black men. Now, there was also an earlier bill during the war called the Wade-Davis Bill, which kind of, even though it was during the war, it was dealing with how they would handle things after the war.
I think it was 1864, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When things were kind of starting to ramp down.
Yeah. And basically what that would have required if it passed would be that it would require the majority of the population of each Confederate state to take the ironclad oath, basically swear that they had never aided the Confederacy, in order for said state to be readmitted into the Union. Now, this would basically have meant that the Confederate States would not have been readmitted to the Union for a long period of time, several years, maybe even decades. Lincoln actually pocket vetoed this bill and basically just refused to pass it. And that's because Lincoln instead favored the 10% figure, which is what eventually went through.
Yes, if 10% of people say that the Confederacy is bad, that means the whole state thinks the Confederacy is bad, which is that's some logic.
Yeah.
We included the Wade-Davis bill in this podcast just to, illustrate that there were members of Congress who, fundamentally believed that, the Confederacy needed to be, culturally reshaped and, fundamentally believed that they needed to atone. They needed to recognize that what they did was bad. And because that bill was vetoed and other measures, that would never happen. The South would not have to account in ways other than blood for their actions.
Yeah.
Now, the other great idea was the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the most interesting institutions in the history of the United States. The Freedmen's Bureau, officially the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, was established in 1865 to provide support for recently freed slaves. This support focused on both immediate measures, such as providing former slaves with legal documentation and reuniting them with family members they had been separated from. Remember, under chattel slavery, if someone owns you, they can sell you, they can sell your kids, they can sell your husband. There's absolutely nothing keeping families together, and obviously a lot of families want to find each other, even if, someone's in Maryland, someone else is in Florida. The Freedmen's Bureau also did more long-term goals, such as improving the economic and educational standings of African Americans. You gotta remember, a lot of these slaves couldn't read, which means it's very hard to understand your legal rights and whatnot. A lot of them didn't really formally even have a last name. They didn't necessarily have birth certificates. A lot of them didn't know exactly how old they were. The fundamental, basics of, I am a human being who exists in this government, here is the documentation that proves that I exist in this government, they lacked it. Now, the Bureau was reduced in its effectiveness due to having a limited funding from Congress. It operated under the Department of War and was headed by General Oliver Otis Howard. Southern Democrats despised the Bureau, claiming it provided help to blacks that had never been afforded to whites, and that it would lead to black dependency on the government. This is actually untrue. The Bureau did extend actually a lot of support to poor whites in the country, but whatever. They also claimed it was an infringement on states' rights, in case you've ever wondered what the states' rights argument has been used for. Johnson attempted to veto the Bureau's renewal, because he attempted to veto everything, but was overridden by Congress. The Bureau's ability to uplift the economic well-being of African Americans was also limited by the racial conceits of its leadership. While most Bureau men genuinely believed in integrating black Americans into wider American society, they also held a strong belief in the importance of work, and thus encouraged the freedmen into signing labor contracts with their former masters, therefore endorsing the highly exploitative system of sharecropping, which we will get into later.
Yeah. With what limited funding it had, the Bureau did have a lot of success in providing education to African Americans. Over 1,000 schools were built in the South, and many historically black universities trace their origins to projects began by the Bureau. And a lot of people say that this is really the lasting, most positive legacy of the Bureau, is really starting a lot of the, the drive for education for African Americans. From a historical standpoint, the Bureau is also significant in that it represented the first federal social welfare institution in the United States. Unfortunately, it would be a short-lived institution, as funding for it was terminated by Congress in 1872.
Yeah, it's a 7-year institution, but you might have thought it was weird that this was run out of the Department of War, but where else would you run it out of? This is an America without a Department of urban development, housing and urban development. This is a government. There's no FBI. There's no CIA. There's all of the there's no EPA. All of the alphabet soup of government agencies and powers. I think even half of the secretaries in the president's cabinet that exists today don't exist. The U.S. government is tiny than it is to now. And this is the U.S. doing something that they wouldn't really do again fully until the fucking New Deal.
Yeah.
60 years later. And this is partially why I say Reconstruction is a crossroads in history, and how things could happen different. Because you can imagine this leading to the United States of America becoming a far more cohesive nation state with government directly interacting with people on a day-to-day or at least regular basis, and moving to do things in people's lives, organizing on a large scale. That is how special the Bureau was. It's also probably worth mentioning that the Bureau got a lot of help from thousands of black Americans in the North that migrated to the South to help their Southern compatriots. They're behind a lot of, for instance, teaching black Southern Americans how to read and making sure they knew their rights, making sure they knew how to vote. And this leads us into talking about the actions of black Americans in the South, who are now, 40% of the Southern population? 30%?
About that. Yeah, about between that.
They're a huge voting bloc. They are a huge amount of people.
They're the majority in some states. I believe they're the majority in South Carolina and Louisiana, I think, as well.
Yeah, and this is why, as we'll get into, Southern whites in those states would be so violent in suppressing that population, because they were the majority population that, if they won office, could, under the democratic process, do whatever they wanted, which obviously a lot of whites don't think is good for them. So we've been talking so far about what the government did for the slaves, the rights that were granted to them, the things that were provided to black Americans. But it's a complete mistake to view African Americans as being passive actors in Reconstruction, merely receiving or being withheld rights from white politicians. Rather, black civic leaders, use your words, Azalea, organized equal rights campaigns on a vast scale throughout the South and even into the North. Reconstruction would see black politicians for the first time in U.S. history be elected in significant numbers across the South. African Americans came to occupy a significant share of the seats in the legislature of states such as Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. South Carolina became the first state with a majority black legislature in 1867. In the subsequent decades, 16 African Americans would be elected or selected to serve in Congress, including 2 senators from Mississippi, Hiram Rhodes Revels and Blanche Bruce. While Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, that is a fucking name, would become the first black governor in U.S. history, being the governor of Louisiana. Altogether, around 2,000 black leaders would come to hold office on the local, state, and federal level throughout Reconstruction. And again, this is 2 years after the Civil War ends. Like, as soon as these people got rights, they immediately picked them up and started remaking society into a place that they wanted to live in. From the absolute jump. And around half of these leaders had been slaves before the Civil War. That's just absolutely nutty to me. Like, and amazingly inspiring as to like what people can do when they are invested in, or even when they're just given a chance. Like, you're a guy tilling a field, being beaten regularly, and suddenly you get an opportunity, and now you're a state congressman. Because that's what you have the ability to do. And I think part of Reconstruction is telling the story of what people can do when they are given just an inch, the absolute miles they can take in advocating for themselves.
Yeah. And you know, like we mentioned,
Benton Stewart Pinchback. Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback.
It is a name. Yeah, like we mentioned earlier, before the 15th Amendment, black people could not vote, and black men could not vote in northern states. And a big part of why the 15th Amendment became a reality was the presidential election in 1868. Now, in this election, USCS Grant was elected president. Grant was representing the Republican Party, and he was going up against Horatio Seymour, who was a Democrat. Grant won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, but his share of the popular vote was pretty narrow. It was just 52%, which showed the increasing strength of the Democrat Party after years out of power. However, black voters were very important to Grant's Electoral College victories in the South. And that combined with black support for the Republican Party, you know, most of these elected black leaders we're talking about were Republicans. Actually, virtually all of them were. And that really combined to encourage the Republican Party to push for the 15th Amendment, because they were seeing that, you know, black voters were coming out and supporting them and giving them victories. Now, this rise of African American political power, of course, would not go without a white response. For white Southerners, the prospect of sharing power with black leaders, or even worse, living under them, was utter anathema. While the northern white Reconstructionists viewed African Americans as people who had to be saved and uplifted to conform with society, Southerners viewed them as inherent inferiors who would never be equal to whites. Resistance to Reconstruction took the form of both political pressure applied by Democrats in Congress to the national government and violent actions organized by their supporters in the South. Collectively, this would form a political movement known as the Redeemers. In 1870, Georgia became the last state to be readmitted to the Union. The work of the Redeemers would now go into full effect as they sought to transform the South back into its antebellum image while remaining a part of the United States. The first white terrorist group to crop up would be the most infamous of them all, the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was founded in 1865 by Confederate veterans and would immediately begin targeting black Republicans. By 1867, the KKK was responsible for around 200 known murders. The actual amount was probably much higher. And by the presidential election of 1868, that figure was in the thousands. Black politicians, voters, teachers, clergy, and people who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time were all victims of KKK violence. The KKK members monitored poll booths, ensuring that no one voted Republican.
Yeah, the Ku Klux Klan was, like, for everyone they killed, they intimidated another 10, if not another 100 more. It was specifically for the purpose of scaring blacks into not asserting their rights. It's worth noting that the Klan we're talking about here is a little different from the Klan of the 20th century that most people are familiar with. It worked differently. It was far more geographically spread. In, say, the 1920s, the Klan would spread all over the U.S. as this weird fascist multi-level marketing scheme. The Klan is weird, but I want to talk a little bit about like a lot of people have probably heard that the Klan is read by a grand dragon or a grand cyclops, and like wonder why they call themselves or why they have this weird name, Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan was eventually like formalized and led by Forrester, former Confederate soldiers, but it was like started by essentially a bunch of Confederate college students and like basically just nerds in their 20s. Like, part of like the white robes and whatnot is they made all these like esoteric rituals and like they had tons of different ranks, like originally, like the goblins and the cyclops, the dragon. It's utterly bizarre when you look into the history, because it's like LARPing nerds who start this like reign of terror, and obviously it would get like way more mainstream and way more formalized and have a lot of Confederate soldiers proper join it in the following years. But remember, if you ever think the Klan is silly, it is. It started with a bunch of LARPing drunken college frat boys and just being fucking dorks, calling themselves the Cyclops, the Dragon, wearing bed sheets and being like, oh, I'm a scary ghost man. And then they also happened to then go and kill a bunch of black folk and intimidate them, which of course became very popular in the rest of the South. But they are losers. They are fucking losers. And you should never forget that. All right, Jay, back to you.
The Klan's extreme violence would not go unchecked. The Grant administration viewed the KKK for what it was, a violent extremist political movement, and began a series of measures to dismantle it. Grant pushed for the passing of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 71, which outlawed the Klan and gave him the power to use the army to stomp out their voter intimidation tactics in the South. The Klan was declared a terrorist organization, and hundreds of Klansmen were brought up on charges by the newly created Justice Department. Like, this period is also when the Justice Department becomes a thing. By 1872, the KKK had effectively ceased to exist as a movement, and voter intimidation had declined sharply throughout the South.
This would not stop the state legislature of Tennessee putting a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the first leader of the Klan, in their House of Representatives until, wasn't it removed in 2020?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, great fucking time. Now, the suppression of the KKK is notable because it shows the immense power of the federal government and what they could bring to bear when they desire to do so. The government could not change the minds of white Southerners, but it could certainly scare the likes of the KKK into compliance with the threat of legal prosecution. This was contingent, however, on the government being willing to undertake such an effort. With the Ku Klux Klan effectively dissolved, the Redeemer movement of the 70s did not renounce violence. Instead, the Klan was followed by groups like the White League in Louisiana and Red Shirts in Mississippi and the Carolinas, which were coordinated, better armed, and better led than the first Klan. The White League would be particularly notable in their ambitions and actions. In August of 1874, the League captured and lynched 6 white Republicans and up to 20 black freedmen in the Red River Parish. Parish is the Louisiana version of a county. The following months, they attempted a coup d'etat in Louisiana, attacking Republican Governor William Kellogg and briefly capturing downtown New Orleans before fleeing the city upon the arrival of U.S. Army troops sent by President Grant. This is a treasonous, slave-loving country still in basically open revolt to the U.S. government.
Yeah. And, the White League had gone further than the Klan ever had in actually attempting to take over a state government. Yet, unlike the Klan, the League was not heavily targeted for prosecution. The reason for this was that by 1874, the political climate of the nation had begun to shift. The immediate post-war period has seen a boom in economic activity in the U.S., particularly in the form of railroad expansion. Investors pumped huge amounts of money into railroad projects, creating a bubble that burst in 1873. The collapse of the railroad bubble coincided with the economic downturn in Europe and would lead to the Panic of 1873, which would basically be the start of economic depression that would last for most of the decade.
Grant had generally been popular during his first year in office, but even before the panic, trust in his administration had declined due to a series of scandals, ones that are quite funny. Grant tended to deeply trust his friends and associates, leading to corruption and nepotism becoming prevalent throughout his administration, on a level that was weird even for the 1800s, in which corruption in government was just like the baseline. So, for example, in 1869, the robber barons Jay Gould and James Fisk used Grant's brother-in-law in an attempt to influence the U.S. government and manipulate the price of gold in a way that was favorable to them as part of a large scheme that ended up collapsing and causing a temporary panic that tanked the stock market for months. In 1871, it was revealed that 2 of Grant's import collectors under the Treasury Department were involved with a corruption scheme in which they were storing goods in private warehouses at exorbitant fees in exchange for bribes. In 1875, the administration was swept out in a vast corruption scandal known as the Whiskey Ring, when it came to light that several distillers had been 4 years engaged in tax evasion coordinated with the Treasury Department officials who they had bribed. Grant initially took the initiative in prosecuting this ring, but when it was revealed that his friend and personal secretary Orville E. Babcock was involved in it, Grant interfered with the prosecution in order to get Babcock acquitted.
The Democrats had once dominated the nation's politics, and they recognized all of this as an opportunity to reclaim that old position of strength. The poor economy and the many scandals of the Grant administration, the ones we mentioned are not all of them, there are more. These provided perfect material for a Democratic Party comeback. It also gave them a way of targeting the Grant administration when Grant used the army to suppress Democratic voter intimidation schemes in the South and in New York. Now, these schemes were real. The Democratic Party was trying to intimidate voters, but the Democrats could just say, we're doing nothing wrong. We're being oppressed by a clearly authoritarian, corrupt regime. Now, as we've mentioned earlier, white Northerners, including most Republicans, believed strongly in the idea that American society was based around economic opportunity and the righteousness of labor. For them, it was natural that black people should have to work for their former masters in order to become a part of this society.
And that their former masters still had a claim to the land that they held under the Confederacy, which they didn't necessarily have to. There were lots of people in the North who thought that the logical thing to do was to chop all of these slave plantations into 40-acre plots and dole them out with a mule to the slaves that had formerly worked on, which is where we famously get the 40 acres and a mule concept.
Yeah.
And that was a thing that could have happened, and that even, I think Sherman actually did do that in certain places.
Yes.
And a lot of that land would, of course, be revoked and taken back at the end of the story.
Yeah. Like we mentioned, most Northerners were very, very racist. Several state referendums to allow black people the right to vote had failed in the North prior to the 15th Amendment. And, again, during the Civil War, some of the largest riots in U.S. history occurred in New York and Philadelphia, where, white Northerners attacked and murdered African Americans out of hatred and resentment.
While most Northerners had remained behind the cause of the Union during the Civil War, few saw it as desirous to serve and potentially die in the occupation of the South afterwards. The militaristic appetite of the country was shifting towards the old foe, the Native Americans, as efforts to pacify, which is to say ethnically cleanse, and settle the West began anew after the war. Heroes of the Union Army would switch to genociding natives after having fought for the unity of the country, which, by the way, if you would like to hear how those former Union officers would do in genociding those natives, I would heavily suggest that you listen to the second episode of this podcast, being the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer would lead a bunch of them into a completely disastrous routing. In general, the mood of the country had begun to shift away from Reconstruction. Most Northerners viewed the job as done. The Civil War had been won, slavery had been abolished, the former separatist states had returned to the Union. The government had shown that it was capable of putting down blatant rebellious acts such as the attempted Louisiana coup. What reason was there to continue the military occupation of the South? And, less now, but there are still people in the South, when you bring up disadvantages faced by black Americans, will say, listen, we freed them, didn't we? That set everything to this neutral playing field of which everyone then rose by their own merits or lack thereof.
Yeah.
It's amazing how the language we use today was just so set in place by the language they used then, and is a direct continuation over the course of 150 years, almost unchanged. It's completely wild.
Yeah, you see the same dog whistles that go on with welfare, and how welfare will just make African Americans or insert minority of your choice here dependent on the government. The same exact language from this Reconstruction period as you would have coming out of Ronald Reagan's mouth or out of, Republicans today. It's really, how kind of amazing how consistent the messaging is. And also, I forgot, I didn't write it in the documents that, we're reading off of somewhat, but we shouldn't downplay the role that violence played in this whole thing. the violence of white militant groups in the South, because they made it so that occupying the South was more expensive and more difficult. The government had to send in armies to deal with the problems they were creating. And that's a part of why people in the North just became tired of Reconstruction. We're going through all this effort and again, we already won the Civil War. We already freed the slaves. Why are we doing this? Why are we running around the South putting out fires, basically? And we like to think in America that we're a country where violent, terrorists can't affect politics. We did an episode about fascism in Europe and how the fascists there use violence to influence electoral politics. And we like to think we're immune from that. And we very much are not. And the Reconstruction shows that.
It's also, I don't know if this is in our notes, but I've heard it widely reported that a lot of the hesitation to support black men and black workers from white Northerners came from fears that this former slave population would move north and compete with former Union soldiers for jobs. And there were a lot of scares like that.
That was a big part of those draft riots. Those riots, they're called draft riots because they began with resistance to the draft, but they quickly snowballed out to general hatred of African Americans because a lot of them feared, again, talking about consistency of messaging. It's, they'll take our jobs fear. And that's sort of sentiment. Now, in 1876, America entered another presidential election year. Ulysses S. Grant had declined to run for a third term. Remember, that's something which he could have technically done, which would lead to the Republican Party to eventually pick Rutherford B. Hayes as its candidate. Facing the Ohio Republican was the New York Democrat Samuel Tilden. Now, after a very close campaign, Tilden defeated Hayes in the popular vote, but Hayes held an advantage by just one single elector in the Electoral College. Widespread confusion and allegations of fraud and disenfranchisement meant, however, that multiple states had yet to select all of their electors. Now, this would lead to basically just months of confusion and back and forths over who had won. Now, the result of this contested election was the Compromise of 1877. The Republicans and Democrats struck an informal agreement in which the undecided electors would be awarded to Hayes, giving him the presidency, while once in office, Hayes would withdraw federal troops from the South. Hayes would uphold his end of the bargain, and in 1877, the last U.S. troops occupying the former Confederate States of America began to leave. As these troops were ultimately the only thing standing in the way between African Americans and the white terrorists, their departure paved the way for new waves of racial violence and political intimidation. And remember, even though a lot of these African Americans are organizing politically, the white people are the ones who still have all of the weapons, basically, and they're the ones who are staffing all of the police departments and have, a lot of the positions of power, like judges, which are things which aren't elected, which weren't, you can't change overnight. So they basically have a monopoly over violence. By the 1880s, the Redeemer Democrats had regained control over every state government in the South. White Republicans were forced out of power and often out of the region altogether. Black Republicans were similarly expelled and often killed. The former leaders of the Confederate States had returned to power and set about dismantling Reconstruction to the best of their abilities.
While the Democrats could not reinstate slavery or officially ban African Americans from voting, they could do just about everything else to roll back the clock on Reconstruction. Sharecropping, which had already cropped up after the end of the war, remained the economic structure of the agrarian South going forwards. Under this system, black farmers were pressured into entering highly unequal contracts with white landowners, trapping them in an exploitative system. Essentially, you would live on and till the land that the white owner owned. And the white owner would rent you the seed that you would use to plant the crops, and would rent you the tools and rent you the house that you lived in, which is often pretty bad. And then you would have to pay the share of the crop, and you would have to pay off essentially what they called your rent. And this basically trapped black Americans in sort of cycles of really not being able to save money or build up capital, because so much of their money was being taken by these rent-seeking landowners. So-called Jim Crow laws were passed, enforcing segregation and depriving black Southerners of equal opportunity to their white counterparts. Often these Jim Crow laws weren't any different than the black codes that had existed in the South before the Civil War. Literacy tests and other means were used to disenfranchise black voters at the ballot box. White supremacy was legally, economically, and culturally enshrined in the South, or re-enshrined, if you like.
Yeah. Like on those literacy tests, I remember when I was in AP US history, one of the exercises we did was like, try to pass one of these tests. And you might see a literacy test and like, oh, it's only seeing if you can read. No, these things were difficult to pass. Like, majority of people would not pass one of these tests today.
And they weren't meant to be passed. Like, and a lot of people didn't have to take them. Exactly, like whites weren't given them.
They had, a clever thing called the grandfather clause, meaning if your grandparents or your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. You didn't have to take the test. Of course, this would mean that people who could vote, people whose ancestors could vote before the Civil War, aka white people, could vote no problem. Black men were not so lucky. Now, from a historiographic standpoint, the righteousness of the South and the Confederacy was spread through the rise of the lost cause narrative. Now, this narrative spread the idea that the Confederate cause was a just one, and that the war was waged to uphold states' rights and Southern chivalry against the desires of the North. Confederate generals were cast as gallant heroes, save for those who had supported Reconstruction after the war, like Longstreet. These heroes and their men were brave warriors who fought against overwhelming odds and were defeated only by the butcher-like tactics of drunken monsters such as Grant and Sherman. The lost cause narrative has yet to lose its potency both in and outside of the former Confederacy, as evidenced, by every time you see somebody in Indiana or California or New York driving around with a Confederate flag bumper sticker on their pickup truck.
It is weird how at this point it seems to be more common outside of the former Confederacy than in it. Partially because, we have to deal with it. I was 16 and, yelling at people in, my high school youth choir about the heritage not hate bullshit. Well, at the end of this podcast, I'm going to go on a rant about what it's like to grow up in the South and how the Civil War is seen in the Lost Cause. But, just to illustrate to you how, insane this is, and how, widespread this sort of viewpoint is. In 2014, my family buried my great-grandmother, and in the funeral home, many of the walls were decorated with these beautiful paintings that depicted the Civil War and often showed generals like Stonewall or Lee up on a horse with the rays of light beaming down on them, and there's no blood or dirt on their uniforms, and they look mighty and strong. When we buried my uncle in 2021, those paintings had been removed, so points if you want to give it to them. And I remember they didn't replace them with anything. It's now just like a white wall. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's
Yeah, and like,
Because like when I was a 10th grader, like just strolling through the hallway of that funeral home and like noticing, I was like, damn, this is a bit much. Now that was in Cordial, Georgia, town which no one has ever heard of because it's about 15 miles south of nowhere. But still, there are parts in the South where many of those paintings are still up. There, the Black Lives Matter uprisings of 2020 did a dent in a lot of the bullshit, but like, there's my county that I live in built a Confederate war monument in like 2009. Like it's not like a man on the horse. It's not like a statue, but like there's a separate, but behind the library in the county where I live, there's like this big war memorial. It's like, here's everyone from the county who's died in wars. And it's like, here's people who died fighting for our country in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, World War I, the war between the states, that's as often referred to during the South. And there's all these flags flying. And then like, say 10 yards away from that, there is like a special it's relatively low key. It's like a 10-foot tall obelisk that's like dedicated to the brave soldiers that fought in the war between the states, and it's like dedicated by a National Guard major general in like 2010.
yeah, like, you often hear the phrase, history is written by the winners. That's really not true in a lot of cases. It's true if the vanquished foe no longer exists, but if they're still around and if they're still, especially in positions of power, they can have a big control over the historical narrative. You'll see a lot of echoes of the lost cause in Germany and, after World War I, where you have, the stabbed in the back myth. And like in both instances, you have the idea that like these were chivalrous movements upholding their way of life.
They knew they were damned, but they fought anyway with gallantry and bravery in the face of it turns them into fucking Hollywood heroes.
Yeah, and appropriately, this is where a lot of, we've talked about Grant. And Grant was obviously not a perfect president. His administration was very corrupt. But like Grant for years will be made out into this drunkard brute of a man who just threw away used human wave tactics and just used his soldiers as meat shields to mow down the Confederates. And the Confederates
that is what I was taught in my AP US history class in the year of our Lord 2014.
Yeah, because the reason why that's the case is because a lot of the historians in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, writing about the Civil War are Southerners with a pro-Southern bias, and they have a big role in shaping the narrative on the Civil War. And that's why General Lee, in comparison, even though he was behind his fair share of failed attacks, I mean, Pickett's charge was under his command. But Lee is made out into this brilliant, gallant, Napoleon of the South, while Grant is a butcher.
Sherman's march to the sea also is constantly... I mean, listen, there were plenty of acts of horror and butchery that happened in the end of the Civil War. Whenever war happens, whenever soldiers go anywhere, people get abused, women get raped, shit gets burned, things get stolen. It happened in the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Like, it's happening right now in Ukraine. This is just how humans function during war. But, Sherman's March to the Sea did have destruction of infrastructure and some abuse of civilians in it. But it is often heavily exaggerated in my state of Georgia as to how brutal it was.
Yeah, it's like the way it is. It's like Sherman is made out to be like Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan, like slaughtering, entire towns as he goes through the South, which is very much
Yeah,
not
there's
the
little
case.
talk about Sherman's general order to redistribute the land that he was taking to the slaves that had been working it and attempting to create like people who had the land and the money to sustain themselves and
And
build a new class of and power base in the South.
and we can very clearly see what the U.S. Army would do when actually ordered to destroy civilians just a decade later, with the Indian Wars. And that's very much not what was happening in the South.
Yeah, that shit and then Wounded Knee after it is, as we've discussed this podcast, a completely different 17 orders of magnitude in brutality.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's good that they weren't brutal, to be clear, or were less brutal, but still.
Yeah. Now, this reversal of Reconstruction set back the prospect of equality by over a century. That's not even an exaggeration. This can be seen quite visibly by looking at the numbers of black elected officials in the country. During Reconstruction, there were thousands of them. By the end, there were only a handful. A gap of 86 years stands between the terms of the last Reconstruction-era black senator, that being Blanche Bruce of Mississippi, and the election of the first post-Reconstruction black senator, Edward Brooke of Massachusetts. 117 years stand between the second African-American governor, Douglas Wilder of Virginia, and the first PBS Pinchback of Louisiana.
117 years.
Yeah. A big part of this is because the next big initiative to push for equal rights wouldn't come until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, 7 decades after the end of Reconstruction. And African Americans in the South and across the country today continue to lag behind their white counterparts in terms of income, education, health, safety, and opportunity.
And the crucible of the Civil Rights Movement was Martin Luther King's actions in Georgia, a state that elected its first black senator. Let's see, 16 months ago? Yeah, 16 months ago. Wait, 14. Depending on when you're listening to this. The decision to not punish who was responsible for the war and not change the power dynamic of the South would have lasting consequences that we live with today. Right now, as you are walking down the street, it affects you. It affects everyone you know, no matter what color their skin was. Because our leaders chose what society we were going to live with before our great-grandparents were born. We have now reached the epilogue where I'm going to thicken my accent for a bit and talk to other Southerners in the audience about this stuff. When you grow up in the South, there's this thing that happens to every kid in elementary school, where in the 3rd grade or 4th grade, they'll learn some basic American history, and they'll be like, oh, the Civil War happened, and the North was good, and the South was bad, and yada yada. And this little thing, this little spark, little pinch will happen in the back of everyone's brain. The South was bad. No, that can't be true. And that is not a bad instinct. That's just a natural human instinct that any 9-year-old, any 10-year-old would have. This little part of you resists. And think about that term, the South. Yes, there's the West as this sort of like metaphorical ideal of this lost era of American history. There, people say the North, but there is no like region in the United States. It's just that has such a strong conceptualization of being a different place than the South. There is no term geographically in America that carries more weight than the South, because Southerners decided that it would be. The Southern Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, remolded the South out of Reconstruction into a fiefdom of white people where the country, it was essentially its own country, and where it was a civilization that was heavily extractive, completely white dominated, incredibly capitalist, where a tiny micro clique of white landowners sat on top of everyone else. And the same people who were ruling that land before the Civil War, the same people who made the decision to kick off a conflict that killed over 500,000 Americans, those same people were in charge of the South afterwards. They became in charge of the governments, in charge of the universities, in charge of the libraries, in charge of the churches. And they, like every human being, would claim they're the good guys, that they're the underdogs. And they would get to write this story. And they would get to affect your brain. They would get to create the air that you, the sort of cultural air, the cultural miasma that you live in. The South today is broadly the most diverse part of the country. The most diverse region. I live in Georgia, an incredibly diverse state. And I can, in my state, go to a school that's got about 70% white kids, maybe 65% white kids, that has a 96% graduation rate. And I can then get in my car and I can drive 30 minutes down the road to a school that has a, say, 45% white kids. And most of them are in the International Baccalaureate program, that has a 46% graduation rate. In my town. Money, debt, illness getting passed down from one generation to another was started in Reconstruction. The entire Confederacy, the entire South was lit aflame by the Civil War. A fire that could have burned away centuries of hate and oppression. And there were black people who worked to build something different. And there were white people who were willing to build it with them. But then a white majority of violent, bigoted fascists were allowed to implement their genocidal, white supremacist state of using blacks only for labor and denying them any semblance of humanity. And those people were the same inhuman monsters that were doing it before the Civil War. They kept doing what they were doing. Their cause was never lost. But for a brief moment in history, 12 fucking years, some good people interceded and stopped them from doing it. And then it went right on back to oppression. Not just because the evil people acted, but because good, decent men failed to act and actively chose to ignore the problem. And they cast the die that would choose our lot that exists today. That exists the reason why I had to argue with dumbass kids from Lakeside on my fucking choir tour when I was 17. Why I have to get in fights at my school and my church. Why I have to deal with fucking QAnon stickers and Confederate flags on the back of cars when I'm driving to get groceries. All of this shit is because of incompetence from Northerners allowing evil Southerners to act. It's because of a crossroads of history that we faced and the path that our leaders, our high-born, college-educated aristocracy chose to lead us down, that we are where we are. So just remember, if we ever come to another crossroads, to another flashpoint in American history, just think about where they'll try and lead us then. This has been the No One Is Competent podcast. A labor of love of me and Jay, or at least what Jay can summon emotionally. That is what he calls love. I don't know necessarily what we would call it. We do this with no ads, no sponsors, no ulterior motives. We just like getting content out there, and, I personally like to talk. Jay likes to write things. We would heavily appreciate it if you would go onto the iTunes store, rate and review us. We are trying to get to 10 reviews. Please put us there. It would help the podcast out a lot. You can email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. You can follow us at Twitter at @not_competent. Jay is on Twitter at jharrys48. I am on Twitter at Azalea Wyatt. Those things are, of course, linked in the description of the podcast, whether you're on Spotify or YouTube or iTunes or Anchor or wherever you're listening to this. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce. There will be, of course, another episode 2 Fridays from now. That's about it.